I love Grace Church. I love Grace Church. I've been in churches where I'm not so sure I loved that church, and I wasn't so sure I want to bring my friends that I was sharing the gospel with, just because it just felt, I knew it was right, but I wasn't super enthusiastic. But you know what? I am enthusiastic. My daughter's going to graduate, and she's going to come back, and she's going to get married, and I want her here with her husband, not just so she can be close to me, which is a benefit, but so she can be with you. I believe that God has his hand on Grace Church right here in Peoria. And I know that if he has his hand on this church, then he will be glorified, because that's what he has designed his church to do. And so with that expression of enthusiasm and excitement, I say but. Because at the same time that I say that, without hesitation, I know for a fact that in this room, right here, there are people who have been hurt by somebody in this room right here. I know for a fact that there are families that have extended themselves relationally and felt rebuffed by people right here in this room. I know for a fact that there are people in this room right here that have a superior air about themselves, thinking that they are more committed to God because they study his word more than somebody else right here in this room. I know for a fact that there are people right here listening to me right now who are not reconciled to somebody else in this room. So this passage, 1 Corinthians 13, turn there. We'll get right to it. We'll take care of some business. And we'll see what God has to say about what I just explained. Let me remind you that in chapter 12, that we heard last week that Paul is discussing spiritual gifts. And he presents that, what Chris preached on last week, that famous analogy of the church as the body of Christ. Now, Paul will resume that discussion on the spiritual life in 1 Corinthians 14, but right here in the middle of chapter 12 and chapter 14, watch how smart I am, there's chapter 13. And chapter 13 is weird, because in the midst of this discussion on spiritual gifts, Paul places a parenthesis here. He wedges it in right in between 12 and 14. And he does it, and it's just not like like an open paren, here's some stuff to say, close paren. It's a poem. It's a beautiful poem. It is artful and winsome. And because of the way that we see them wedging it in there, as we're studying 1 Corinthians, we kind of go, ding, 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 this might be important. This is not just a parenthesis, it's a kind of a good idea or something to throw away. Right here, Paul connects love and the spiritual gifts to each other. At the very end of chapter 12, he says this: pursue love and strive for the spiritual gifts, and I will show you a more excellent way. Chapter 13 is a more excellent way. Specifically and more precisely, that could be translated as that I'm going to show you a way that's beyond measure. And where I want you to catch is this theme of this is a church in Corinth that is used to measuring themselves, their abilities and their status relative to one another. It's their obsession even. And so Paul comes in with 1 Corinthians chapter 13, describes a way that's beyond measure. And what is this way? It's love. Of course it is. It's love. Now, I'm going to read 1 Corinthians 13 in just a moment. And as I read this passage, I'm going to read it in a particular way. So I'm going to ask you to bear with me on this. I'm not being disrespectful. I'm making a point. And I'm hoping that you'll see this point as we walk through this time together this morning. Hopefully then you'll see why. 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 1. A very familiar, who's ever heard this passage, by the way? Okay. If I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but I have not love, then I'm a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. And if I give away all I have, and if I deliver up my body to be burned, but have not love, I gain nothing. Because love is patient, and love is kind. Love does not envy or boast. It's not arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It's not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth, because love bears all things and believes all things and hopes all things and endures all things. Oh, sweet love never ends. And as for prophecies, they're going to pass away. As for tongues, they'll cease. As for knowledge, it'll pass away. For we know in part, and we prophesy in part. But when that perfect comes, the partial, it'll pass away. When I was a child, I spoke like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I gave up childish ways. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I have been fully known. So now faith, hope, and love abide, these three. But the greatest of these is love. Beautiful, isn't it? It is beautiful. Now, I laid it on a little bit thick. And if you're wondering, what is he talking about? I want you to know that we need to be careful. We need to look at this very familiar passage, and we need to understand this passage in context. We need to understand it wedged in between 12 and 14. We need to see it placed inside this letter to the Corinthian church. See, what happens is that we have heard this passage at weddings, haven't we? We've seen this passage on the refrigerator, haven't we? And it's used that way because oftentimes it is incorrectly understood. It's incorrectly understood as praising the value of romantic human love. And Paul doesn't put it in here, in between 12 and 14, wedge it in there right now to introduce a poem, a song, if you will, that affirms something that is already present in the community of Corinth. He presents this passage as a way to introduce into this community something that is not there, something that they need, and they need it desperately. Remember the Corinthian church. It's marked by diversity. There's married, there's unmarried, there's widows, there's children, there's converted Gentiles. That makes up the majority of the people, but there's also Jews of high status. There's slaves, there's free people. There's all different types of gifts. But we see early in this letter that Paul is writing to them, and he calls them babies. And because they're babes in their understanding, what happens is they miss the opportunity to glorify God in their differences. This whole letter is an indictment to their shallow understanding of the grace of God and truth. Their misunderstanding that makes them weak against the temptation to be divisive. That's what they are known for. God's church in Corinth is known for being divisive. They're impatient. They're cruel. They're self-exalting, arrogant, puffed up, petty, rude, ungracious, offensive, and easily offended. This was a community fragmented rather than enriched by their differences. So this passage is a far cry from an adoring couple standing at the altar declaring unwavering devotion to each other. Paul is artfully, winsomely, strongly correcting this church that does not know what love is. This is wedged in between 12 and 14 because Paul knows who he's talking to. Immature Christians who are going to be dazzled by the bright lights of spiritual gifts. This is a poem. Let's call it an ode to love. And it has 3 stanzas that we'll go through. Up until this point in the letter, Paul's discussion about speaking in tongues and prophecy and knowledge and insight has affirmed that these are things that the church holds, that God has given them on purpose. They're necessary, they're desirable. But now in this love poem, Paul makes a decisive, intentional shift so that he can diminish the dazzling attraction to these spiritual gifts. These things are important, but they still do not qualify as the more excellent way. We can do all these things, but love is the key to the excellent way. So let's take a look at the first stanza of this poem. If I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I'm a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. Now remember, the Corinthians are reading this like a letter. It's not taking them 12 months or 15 months or however long to get through 1 Corinthians. It's a letter that they're reading. They're reading this letter. And so they're going to come here into 13 and they're going to go, if they're going to understand that Paul is saying, if I speak in tongues of men and of angels but have not love, I'm a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And that's how you're thinking, Corinthians. And if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but have not love, I am nothing, Corinthians. If I give away all I have, if I deliver up my body to be burned, but have not love, I gain nothing. Paul is saying, look, we can pursue all these different forms of spirituality. Not just the tongues of men, but the tongues of angels, for crying out loud. Learn that in high school. Can't do it. You can pursue proper doctrine and have conversations about the ideal, about the way that things should be, and be so persuasive that people can't even respond to you because you got the truth and you got it down. You can pursue service. I mean, you can take a whole week off of work and go to Mexico and serve those orphans at Rancho 3M. You can even give your very life as a martyr that they would write about, and you would be remembered throughout all of history. But if you don't have love, it won't matter. No matter what you say, Corinthians. No matter what you believe, Corinthians. No matter what you do, Corinthians. You are bankrupt if love doesn't reign over your heart and your intellect and your will. Now, if we stop here, you might go get them, Paul. Go get those dirty Corinthians. You might be mildly motivated to say, okay, yeah, I want love. I want to do all those things, but I want love. I want it to matter. Good. So what do? So in the second verse then, the second stanza here, Paul says this. He says, okay, let me explain something to you, Lucy. He says, love is. Now, in this second stanza, what we have is we have 16 verbs in a row. Now, in our English translations, it doesn't come through super clearly. You know, it's described as with adjective, this love is these things. But Paul, when he's writing this and he's making his point, he's saying here that love is a busy, active thing that never ceases to work. It's always finding ways to express itself for the good of others. His point is not to provide us a flowery description of what love is in some abstract and theoretical sense, but he wants us to know that love does something, and this is what it does, especially what love does to one's brother or sister in the church at Corinth. Paul wants us to remove our notion of love from the realm of romantic sentimentalism. Because if we take it out of that category, then what it will do is this will crush us. It'll capture us. This love will empower us. And I'm just telling you, Paul is not he's not being soft in this. The more I studied this passage, the more I realized that Paul is making a striking point. He is being intentional here. This is what he's saying, verse 4. He says, look, love is patient. Love is kind, and you aren't. Love does not envy or boast like you do. It's not arrogant or rude like you are. It does not insist on its own way like you do. It's not irritable and resentful like you are. Look, love does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but you do. Love rejoices with the truth, and you don't. Love bears all things, believes all things, endures all things. Love never ends. And you've just read the first part of my letter to you guys, and you know exactly what I'm talking about. See, he's saying, look, you need to see the need for love, and specifically that love is patient. It suffers long. But you guys, you're quick to anger. You're resentful and impatient with those who inconvenience you. So you badmouth and complain and you overreact. You explode over the tiniest injustice. And you dream of ways to get even. But love's not like that. Love is kind. Love gives what needs to be given. Love doesn't just give what he wants to give or what the object of your love wants. Love knows what is needed, then gives that, no matter the cost. The kindness in love is a triumph of grace, but you're cruel. Even when you do nice things, you just grit your teeth and you get her done. And if you don't get credit for getting her done, you get hurt or angry. He says, love does not envy or boast like you. It's not selfish like you are. It doesn't constantly measure what you have against what others have. Love is content with God's will and God's glory. It doesn't swagger around saying, look at me. Love doesn't exalt you and show you off. Love boasts in its weakness for the sole purpose of showing off God. It's not arrogant or rude like you are. Love isn't puffed up and self-satisfied, judging others, finding them lacking, always trying to prove you that you know more, that you can do more. Whatever you can do, I can do better. That's not love. Love isn't ill-mannered or uncouth. Love knows when to do the right thing at the right time. I don't like that one. Andrea has this phrase for me called no filter 50. It's embarrassing. Because I'll be like, I'll just be like at the store and I want to connect and be friendly and all that kind of stuff, right? And that's what I want to do. And she goes, you're not being friendly, you're being creepy. And then she'll go, this is what you said. How do you think that person feels? And I go, oh, that's embarrassing. I didn't mean anything by it, but she's totally right. Why? Why is that embarrassing? Why is that a big deal? Thanks to God for my wife who will tell me those things, because you know what? She's pointing me to this right here. That's not love. Love knows when to do the right thing at the right time. It does not insist on its own way like you do. It doesn't grasp and clamor and demand its rights. Love actually cares about the welfare of others. Corinthians, it is not irritable or resentful like you are. Love is not bad-tempered. It's not easily provoked. It's not thin-skinned, easily offended, closed off, and self-protective. Love is actually thick-skinned, soft-hearted, quick to forgive. Love does not rejoice at wrongdoing like you do. But love rejoices with the truth. Love doesn't revel when others grovel. Love doesn't kick a man when he's down. Instead, love takes pleasure in the flowering of truth, in repentance and sincerity. Then we get into this interesting part in verse 7. Do you see in verse 7, there's 4 things, all things, all things, all things, all things. I think this is an amazing picture in verse 7 of the strength of love. The strength of love in the face of difficulty, in face of the pressures of this life. See, Paul is now, he's looking at how God has designed us to be resilient people. See, it is love that causes us to grow in maturity in the face of trials of life. And if we don't have love, if you Corinthians don't have love, then you will be victims. Victims. You guys ever heard of a guy named Humpty Dumpty? That guy sat on a wall. And Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. And all the king's horses, all the king's men couldn't put Humpty Dumpty back together again. Love sees that story and gets busy. Cheers Humpty Dumpty on and sees an opportunity for Humpty Dumpty in the midst of the trials of life to grow, to be put back together by the king, better than he ever was before. Yeah, he might suffer on the fall, but that suffering is going to complete something in him that's awesome. But if we don't have love, then what we say is this: Humpty Dumpty was pushed. He's pushed. Anytime there's a fall, it must be somebody else's fault, and it must be the worst thing that could ever happen in my life. But love counters that. Why? Because of this. Love bears all things. See, there's a strength and a resilience in the way that God has created us. He doesn't just say, I'm going to make you in my image, go get them. I'm going to make you in my image in a particular way, and then I'm going to empower you in love so that you would be strong in the face of trial, that you would be able to bear all things. Because love doesn't retaliate. It doesn't escape or quit or get discouraged when it's not appreciated. Love believes all things. It's not skeptical and suspicious, assuming the worst case scenario. Why do we always assume the worst case scenario? Because we're afraid of being let down. But perfect love casts out fear. Love is free to examine a situation, to discern a situation, and operate in reality, to see whether it's good or bad, and whether it's good or bad, understand and believe in all things. When love sees a man is down, then love will think about the battle that poor bugger might have fought, right? The struggle that person must have given before he fell. I mean, what happened to Humpty Dumpty on that wall? How much did he try to hang on before he fell? Love will see the possibility of recovery because love hopes all things. Love has a long view of life. See, love it opens our vision into the future, not the now. So love doesn't easily despair. It doesn't despair in the circumstances of today. And I know you have some circumstances that you could probably make a pretty good case that you should despair, just like the Corinthians. But love hopes all things and doesn't despair in circumstances. And you know what? Love hopes all things and doesn't despair in people. And love endures all things. Love endures all things. Because love does not allow for us to embrace an identity as a victim. Love doesn't give up easily. Love fights. Love fights. It's strong so that we can reveal God. And that's what Paul is saying. He's not trying to say here's what you need to, here's my fluffy little poem about love so you can put it into the shape of a heart and have it on your mantle. He's being clear and direct, and the Corinthians know it. And you might be going, Jamie, I'm not sure I like your tone. This might seem a little bit edgy to you. I mean, this is a sermon about love, right? How come I don't feel good? Well, let me give you two things to keep in mind as we consider this text today. Paul's intention wasn't that this text would be easily digested. He's not looking for its readers to feel comfortable and affirmed. His whole point for jamming this right in here, right where he has it, the way that he has it, is to create discomfort, to create discomfort that would lead to an attitude adjustment, a shift in beliefs and behaviors so that discomfort will go away, so that they would actually do what they're designed to do, which is to glorify the Creator God of the universe. See, this is where this passage can go off the rails. A misunderstanding of this passage outside of this context that we're giving you now creates trouble not only for the expectations regarding the day-to-day realities of our marriages, but also for the realities of the church. How excited were you to get up this morning and get to church? How excited were you as you thought about Grace Church and all the people in here? I'm going to tell you something. Sometimes I'm not that excited. Why? Because I don't understand what God's doing in church. I'm not convinced that the church is something more than just us gathering a bunch of people that we kind of like, that are easy to get to know, that will never offend each other. You know what I'm saying? It's just if you guys all liked football and wings, this would be the easiest job in the whole world. But you know what? If we miss what Paul is saying here, even though we would never say that out loud, that's what we're believing in our heart. And that's what makes us so easily offended. Let me ask you, though, why would this make us feel uncomfortable? What about what Paul is doing? What about the way that I'm presenting this would cause you to kind of wrinkle your nose? Well, I would put it this way. I would say that it's because we think of love as unconditional. I mean, isn't that right? Isn't God's love for us unconditional? I mean, I just sit here and he just gives his love. There's no conditions to be had. And I'm just telling you, that is not a good way to think. Because most of us think of love as unconditional. Behind that, we mean that deep down, you're okay. God accepts you just as you are. He smiles on you even if you don't jump through any hoops. You have intrinsic worth. God accepts you, warts and all. You can relax. You can bask in his smile. And let the basically good, real you emerge. That sounds good. It sounds really good to the end there, doesn't it? See, this is a life, a philosophy, utterly at odds with God's real love. God's love is not unconditional. One author says that it is a subtle deceit. It keeps company with teachings that say to people, peace, peace, when from God's holy point of view, there is no peace. See, if you receive blanket acceptance, then you need no repentance. You just accept it. This blanket acceptance fills you without humbling you. It relaxes you without upsetting you about yourself or thrilling you about Christ. It lets you relax without reckoning with the anguish of Jesus on the cross. Easy, unconditional acceptance is undemanding. It does not insist on or work at changing you. Unconditional love deceives you about both God and yourself. Ladies and gentlemen, we can do better. God does not accept me just as I am. He loves me despite how I am. He loves me just as Jesus is. He loves me enough to devote my life to renewing me in the image of Jesus. That's what Paul is saying in this whole letter. You have been born again in the Spirit, and you're not acting like it. You're acting like you're a slave to sin. And it shows in your division and your lack of love and all these things that characterize you. Paul is saying, look, there is love, and love accomplishes a couple things. There's two ways that we need to look at love and rejoice. Love is restrictive. Oh, no, Jamie. Love is not restrictive. If you love me, Jamie, you'll let me I'll give you my definition. You affirm my definitions of how I should live. And if you affirm that in me and you tolerate that in me, then you're going to love me. It's not true. God's love holds us back from what we would be by ourselves. That's what it does. There's restrictions. There's somebody outside of me saying, this is what the standard is. You need to follow that standard. And you know what? If you're a believer, Mr. Corinthian, then you're going to rejoice in that. But not only is love restrictive, but love compels. It forces us out. It causes us to act for the benefit, for the building up of that body. Remember that? The building up of others so that God himself can be clearly seen. Paul's not beating around the bush. And the reason he's not beating around the bush is because love matters. A person without love is not neutral. A church without love makes the gospel fuzzy. A church with love makes the gospel clear. Love. God's love. Not unconditional love, but the love of God with the condition that he meets, that saves us so that we, who didn't deserve it and are unlovable, can be given a new life and changed into someone who is lovable through obedience and holiness to be like Christ. That kind of love crushes us. It captures us. That kind of love empowers us. And you may look at that list of things and that kind of love and say, holy moly, I can't do that. How in the world? It does crush me. Well, fortunately, he's not done wedging in between 12 and 14. The third stanza says this: love never ends. As for prophecies, they will pass away. As for tongues, they will cease. As for knowledge, it will pass away. For we know in part, we prophesy in part, but when the perfect comes, the partial will pass away. When I was a child, I acted like a child. I spoke like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. But when I became a man, I gave up childish ways. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I have been fully known. Let me read that again. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I have been fully known. So now faith, hope, and love abide, these three, but the greatest of these is love. The opening of this stanza is that love never fails. It never falls. It never stops. Prophecies, tongues, knowledge, all the things that these little baby Corinthian Christians loved, all these dazzling spiritual gifts, all the things that they love, these things fail. They cease. They vanish. It's opposite the character of God's love. Knowledge in part, prophecy in part. Then Jesus comes with the whole picture. We're all children in what we understand and perceive. This imperfect or shadowy vision will be exchanged for the full knowledge that resides in the recognition of this. That ultimately, it's not so much that I know things, but rather that I am known by someone. You're a Christian, and you are known by the Creator God of the universe. You are known. We saw this in chapter 8 concerning the food offered to idols. He says, we all know that all of us possess knowledge. This knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. If anyone imagines that he knows something, he does not yet know as he ought to know. But if anyone loves God, he is what? He is known by God. How do you love this way? What does it look like to be loved this way? It looks like being known by God. And when you're known by God, then you are given a new heart. You're given a heart that has access to the Spirit, to the truth of God, that changes the way that you think. When I know God, then I can battle this flesh that is outside of God, that's all about me, that wants me to label love as me defining me and you tolerating me and you giving to me. And love is this zero game where you just stop loving that person so you can love me more. But God says, no, through the Spirit, through this new heart, you are able to know that love builds on itself and it grows and it grows and it grows in your heart in such a way that you can actually love like this. That's the gospel, ladies and gentlemen. That's good news. To know just as I have been known. He turns to the past tense. Where are we loved? Where are we known by God? He's pointing right at the cross. That right when Jesus Christ died on that cross, we die with him. And then when he raises on the third day, we raise with him in newness of life, and we are known by God. So guess what? We can love like this. All right, real quick. Let's land this plane with a couple so whats. First of all, this. Grace Church. Love includes sacrifice and obedience. Love includes sacrifice and obedience. Don't forget that anytime you hear obedience, there's an assumption that there is somebody who reigns, who rules, who makes up the rules, and then communicates that to you so that you will follow the rules. Obedience means you are subservient to another person. Clearly, that person is Christ. And when we obey him, we glorify him. We reveal him as the King. Jesus teaches that love leads to obedience, and that obedience is a sign of love. It does not delight in evil. It rejoices in truth. It heeds the will of the Father. It desires good for others. But that good always involves God. It always involves obedience to his revealed will. And it oftentimes involves discipline. The Lord disciplines those whom he loves. A church that never disciplines or corrects sin is an unloving church. It's why Paul called the Corinthians arrogant. Grace Church, love involves mercy and compassion. Some of you are really, really easy to love because you like the Cardinals and chicken wings. And some of you are not so easy. You're difficult. But understand this, the easy to love teach us how to love the difficult to love, the annoying ones, the immature ones. Love includes mercy and compassion because love is patient and kind. Paul is telling us that we can assume it will be the people who tempt us to impatience and unkindness that best train us in the ways of love. And finally, this one. The world is watching. The world will both love and hate what we just preached about. Love and hate what our church calls love. If people just love it, then we can be sure that we're offering them something false and worldly. The love of the Father is not in the world, so they will sometimes call love hate and hate love. Our church can only offer a vision of heaven's love as in a mirror dimly. But the good news is this: we can point those who are watching to the one who loves them and the one who loves us perfectly. The perfect who will one day come to welcome us fully into his love. And that's the heart of our faith and our hope. Will you pray with me as we prepare for communion? Father, thank you for this time together. Thank you for this word of love. Holy Spirit, shape us in our thinking in a way that would please you. Strengthen us so you could be glorified. Amen.